My name is Margot Callahan, and I found out I was adopted 3 days after my mother's funeral, standing in her bedroom with her jewelry box open in my hands, 34 years old and suddenly unsure of almost everything I thought I knew about my own life. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I hadn't suspected, not once. Not when my younger brother Derek got the bigger bedroom growing up, the one with the good light, while I got the smaller room facing the driveway. Not when my mother paid for his entire college education without blinking and told me when my turn came that I should look into scholarships since you're the practical one. Not at a single one of the hundreds of family gatherings over 34 years where she introduced Derek first, always first, like his name simply came more naturally to her mouth than mine ever had. I'd spent my whole life assuming that was just how love worked in my family. Unevenly, quietly rationed, like there wasn't quite enough of it to go around, and somehow, without ever understanding why, I'd always come up short. The letter I found folded beneath a false bottom in that jewelry box didn't just explain why I'd been given up for adoption as an infant. It explained who had spent over 3 decades looking for me. And it explained, in my mother's own careful handwriting, exactly what she and my father had chosen to hide from both of us, from me and from the family that had never once stopped searching, to keep that secret buried for good. Let me back up, because I think you need to understand what it feels like to lose your whole sense of yourself twice in the same week, before you understand what it took to finally get some of it back. I grew up in a modest brick house in an Ohio suburb, the older of 2 children, or so I always believed. Derek, 3 years younger, arrived when I was 3, and for as long as I can remember, something in the atmosphere of our household shifted the day he did, though it took me decades to understand that the shift wasn't imagined. My mother, Linda Callahan, was a warm woman in public and a harder one to read in private, the kind of mother who could make a stranger at the grocery store feel like her closest friend, while somehow leaving her own daughter uncertain most days of where she actually stood. My father, Ray, was quieter, mostly present in the way furniture is present, reliably there, rarely commented on, easy to overlook until you needed him and he wasn't quite available either. Derek was, by every visible measure, the center of our family's gravity. He was a naturally easy child, charming in that effortless way some people just are, and my mother orbited him with an attention I never once received in the same quantity. I don't say this to suggest she was cruel. She wasn't, not in any way you could point to directly. It was smaller than that. It was in the way she remembered every detail of his soccer schedule and regularly forgot my piano recitals. It was in the way she framed his elementary school drawings in the hallway and kept mine, when she kept them at all, in a box in the garage. It was in the particular warmth she reserved for his voice on the phone that never quite extended to mine. I want to be fair to Derek here because none of what happened was ever really his doing. He was a child too, receiving the love that was offered to him without any particular awareness that it came at a cost to someone else. If anything, looking back, I think Derek occasionally noticed the imbalance himself, in small, uncomfortable ways he never knew how to name or address. There was a birthday, when he turned 9, when he insisted, out of nowhere, that half of his cake be saved specifically for me, even though I'd already had my own slice. A strange, oddly touching gesture from a child who couldn't have understood the full shape of what he was responding to, but who seemed to sense on some instinctive level that something in our family's arithmetic didn't quite add up fairly. I was a good student, steady and unremarkable in the way that doesn't draw much attention in a household already organized around someone else's spotlight. I got decent grades without much acknowledgement, decent friends with not much involvement from home, and I learned somewhere along the way to stop expecting my accomplishments to register the way Derek's automatically seemed to. There's a particular kind of quiet erosion that happens when you grow up like that. You don't experience it as one dramatic wound. It's smaller, more like water slowly wearing down stone, until one day you look up and realize you've spent your whole life believing you were simply less lovable than the person sitting next to you at the dinner table. There was a specific moment, I remember, around age 11 that I've carried with me longer than almost anything else from my childhood. I'd won a district-wide essay contest, the kind that got you a small trophy and your name read aloud at a school assembly, and I came home practically vibrating with the news. My mother was in the kitchen when I told her. She said, "That's nice, sweetie," without turning fully around the stove. And then, 30 seconds later, when Derek walked in and announced he'd scored a goal in his soccer scrimmage, she dropped the spatula entirely and pulled him into a hug so enthusiastic it knocked his backpack off his shoulder. I stood in that kitchen doorway, 11 years old, holding a trophy nobody had asked to see, and understood something about my place in this family that I wouldn't have language for until I was well into adulthood. There was another incident a few years later that compounded that early lesson in a way I've never quite been able to shake. I was 15, and I'd been quietly saving money from a part-time job to buy myself a decent camera, something I'd developed a genuine passion for through a photography elective at school. I'd saved for nearly a year, carefully, the way I did most things. When my mother found out how much I'd put away, she suggested gently but firmly that it might be more responsible to put that money toward Derek's upcoming travel soccer fees, since he actually needs it for something that matters, and you can always buy a camera later. I gave her the money. I don't think it occurred to me at 15 that I had any real choice in the matter, or that the request itself was even worth questioning. I never did buy that camera. Not until I was almost 30, working steadily, and finally allowing myself small purchases that had nothing to do with anyone else's needs. I still have it. I've never told anyone in my family why it took me that long to own one. My father was better in his own limited way, though better is a low bar when the alternative is barely being seen at all. He'd occasionally take me fishing on weekends, just the two of us, and those mornings felt like the only time in my childhood when I had someone's full, undivided attention. But even then, there was something careful in how he treated me. Not unkind, exactly, but oddly formal, the way you might be with a coworker's child you were fond of, but not quite responsible for in the deepest sense. I used to think that formality was just his personality. I know now it was something else entirely. I moved out for college at 18, grateful for the distance in a way I never fully admitted to myself at the time, and built a life that felt, for the first time, entirely mine. A career in occupational therapy that I'd found on my own, without anyone's encouragement or discouragement shaping the decision, friendships I'd chosen deliberately, a quiet apartment where nobody's attention was being divided between me and someone easier to love. I visited home for holidays, dutifully, and I watched the same pattern replay itself for another 16 years. Derek's promotions celebrated with dinners out, my own promotions acknowledged with a card, sometimes if my mother remembered. There was a period in my late 20s when I tried actively addressing it, not confrontationally exactly, but through small, deliberate tests, mentioning accomplishments more directly, waiting to see if naming them explicitly would finally register the way they never seemed to when I mentioned them casually. It rarely worked the way I hoped. My mother would offer a brief, genuinely sounding acknowledgement, and then, within a few sentences, pivot back to something involving Derek, as though some invisible timer governed exactly how long her attention could remain focused on me before needing to redirect itself. I eventually stopped running those small experiments. There's only so many times you can test a hypothesis before the data simply becomes the accepted shape of your life. There was one Christmas about 5 years ago when Derek announced his engagement over dinner, and my mother cried actual tears of joy, the kind of unrestrained emotion I'd genuinely never seen from her before. I remember sitting there, genuinely happy for him, and also quietly cataloging, the way I'd learned to do without meaning to, all the moments in my own life, my own engagement 4 years earlier to a man named Peter I'd later divorced, that received nothing close to that reaction. My mother had said at the time, "Well, I hope it works out better than it looks like it might," a comment so casually devastating I hadn't even had the words to respond to it directly. It didn't work out as it happened. She never once mentioned that prediction again, though I noticed she remembered it clearly enough to be right. My marriage to Peter had lasted 3 years, and I've thought, more than once since finding my mother's letter, about how much of its slow unraveling traced back to patterns I'd learned long before I ever met him. An instinct to shrink my own needs to make more room for someone else's, a difficulty believing I deserved consistent, undivided attention, even from a partner who genuinely wanted to give it to me. Peter used to tell me, gently, in the last year of our marriage, that I seemed to flinch whenever he tried to prioritize me over something else in his life, as though I were bracing for the inevitable moment he'd change his mind. I didn't understand what he meant at the time. I understand it considerably better now, sitting with everything I've since learned about the family that raised me. My mother was diagnosed with early-onset dementia 2 years ago, and something in me, despite everything, softened toward her almost immediately, the way it does when someone you love, even imperfectly, even unevenly, starts slipping away in pieces. I took on more of her care than Derek did, partly because my work schedule was more flexible, and partly, I think, because some old, stubborn part of me still wanted to earn something from her that I'd never quite managed to earn as a child. I drove her to appointments, I managed her medications, I sat with her through the frightening stretches when she didn't recognize her own kitchen. There was a particular Tuesday, about a year into her decline, when she called me by a name I didn't recognize. Not Derek's name, not mine, something else entirely, spoken with such warmth and familiarity that it startled me more than her confusion usually did. When I gently corrected her, she looked at me with an expression of genuine bewilderment, followed almost immediately by something that looked unmistakably like fear. She didn't explain it. I didn't press her on it, not then, assuming it was simply another symptom of a disease that scrambled names and faces indiscriminately. I understand now, looking back, that it probably wasn't indiscriminate at all. There were good days, too, stretches when the disease seemed to loosen its grip enough for something like her old self to surface. On those days, she'd sometimes reach for my hand in a way she rarely had when she was fully herself, holding on a beat longer than the moment required, looking at me with an intensity that felt, even then, like she was trying to memorize something or apologize for something without quite finding the words for either. There was an afternoon, about 8 months before she died, when she was lucid enough for a real conversation, one of the last we'd have like that. She looked at me for a long moment, an expression on her face I couldn't quite place, somewhere between tenderness and something closer to guilt, and said out of nowhere, "You've always been so much stronger than any of us gave you credit for, Margot. I hope you know that. I hope someday you understand why." I didn't understand what she meant. I filed it away as one more strange thing sick people sometimes say, memory and confusion blurring the edges of ordinary conversation. I had no idea that afternoon just how much weight was sitting behind those words, or how long she'd apparently been carrying them. My mother died in her sleep on a Tuesday in October, 18 months after her diagnosis, with hospice care in the home, and my father asleep in the next room. I got the call at 5 in the morning and drove to the house before the sun had fully risen, arriving before Derek, before anyone, standing alone in the driveway for several minutes before I could make myself go inside. The funeral was well attended, the way funerals for warm, well-liked women in small communities tend to be. Derek gave the eulogy, which felt, even in my grief, an almost too perfect final example of the pattern that had shaped my whole life. I'd written most of the specific, personal memories he used, sharing them with him over the phone the week before because he'd struggled to come up with enough material on his own, and he never once mentioned, standing at that podium, where those memories had actually come from. I didn't say anything about it. I want to be honest about that. Some old, ingrained instinct in me still didn't feel entitled to point out when credit had quietly shifted away from me, even now, even at our mother's funeral. The days immediately after the funeral moved in the strange, foggy way grief tends to, full of casseroles from neighbors and condolence cards, and the particular exhaustion of being handed 100 small logistical decisions while barely able to think clearly about any of them. My father moved through those days almost silently, more withdrawn than I'd ever seen him, and I remember attributing it entirely to grief at the time, without any suspicion that something more specific might have been weighing on him. 3 days after the service, my father asked me to help sort through my mother's belongings, clothes for donation, jewelry to divide between me and Derek's wife, the accumulated small possessions of a life. Derek had already left, back to his own house 2 states away, citing work obligations that felt, as they always had, conveniently timed to avoid the harder parts of family responsibility. I was going through my mother's jewelry box alone in her bedroom, my father downstairs handling calls from the funeral home, when I noticed something odd about the construction of the box, a slight unevenness in the depth of the bottom drawer, barely perceptible unless you were running your fingers along the inside edges the way I happened to be doing while sorting through a tangle of old necklaces. It was the kind of detail I might easily have missed on any ordinary day, but grief, I've since learned, has a way of making your hands move more slowly and more carefully than usual, as though some part of you already senses there's something here worth finding. I pressed gently, and the false bottom lifted free. Underneath was a folded letter, yellowed slightly with age, along with a small manila envelope containing what I could tell immediately before opening it were official-looking documents. My hands were shaking slightly before I'd even unfolded the letter, some instinct already understanding that I'd found something I wasn't meant to find until she'd decided herself that I was ready. My dearest Margot, if you're reading this, then either I finally found the courage to tell you myself before the end, or more likely, knowing my own cowardice about this particular truth, I ran out of time and you found it here, the way I always half expected you eventually would, given how thorough you've always been about everything in your life. I'm sorry either way that it's come to a letter instead of my own voice. I had to stop reading for several minutes, sitting on the edge of my mother's bed, before I could continue. Margot, you are not our biological daughter. Your father and I adopted you as an infant 34 years ago through a private arrangement that was, at the time, kept confidential even to most of our own extended family. We told absolutely no one, not even Derek, who has never known this either. We raised you as our own from the beginning, and in every way that matters to how a family is built, you are our daughter. But I understand, reading this now yourself, that the biological truth changes something for you regardless of how I try to frame it, and I owe you the whole story, not just the comfortable part. I sat very still, the letter trembling slightly in my hands, and kept reading. Your biological mother was a young woman named Josephine Hargrove, barely 20 at the time of your birth, from a family with considerably more money and considerably more complicated history than ours. I'm not going to tell you the full circumstances in this letter. Some of it isn't entirely mine to tell, and some of it I only ever understood in pieces myself. But I will tell you this much. Josephine did not want to give you up. She was pressured into it by her own family under circumstances I believe even now were deeply unfair to her.
The adoption was arranged quickly and quietly, in a way designed to sever contact completely, and my father and I, God forgive us, agreed to those terms because we desperately wanted a child and didn't ask enough hard questions about whether that desire was actually being weighed fairly against everyone else's. There is a second envelope inside this hiding place, Margot. It contains a letter that arrived at our house 11 years ago from an attorney representing your biological grandmother, a woman named Eleanor Hargrove. She had been searching for you for years by that point and had finally located our family through records that were supposed to remain sealed. I never responded to that letter. I told myself at the time that I was protecting you from disruption, from a family with a complicated history I didn't fully understand, from a truth I worried might make you feel less like ours. I understand now, writing this, how much of that protection was actually about protecting myself and my own fear of losing you, rather than genuinely protecting you. My hands had gone cold. I opened the second envelope with fingers that didn't feel entirely like my own. Inside was a letter, 11 years old, on formal legal header letter, from a law firm in Vermont, addressed to my parents, informing them that Eleanor Hargrove, acting on behalf of her granddaughter's biological family, wished to establish contact and share information she believed her granddaughter deserved to know, including, the letter stated plainly in language that made my chest tighten reading it, matters pertaining to a family trust established in the child's name at birth, which has remained untouched and continues to accrue in anticipation of eventual contact. I sat on the edge of my mother's bed for a long time after that, the funeral flowers still wilting downstairs, understanding that the woman I just buried had known for at least 11 years that somewhere out there
Was a family who'd never stopped looking for me, and a truth that might have finally explained why my place in this family had always felt, in some wordless way, slightly borrowed. If you're the kind of person who believes the truth always finds its way eventually, even when it takes decades, this next part is for you. Consider subscribing to Silent Victory Stories so you don't miss where this goes. I didn't tell my father what I'd found, not that day. I drove home instead, the letters sitting on my passenger seat like something radioactive, and sat at my own kitchen table until nearly 3 in the morning, reading my mother's letter over and over, along with the 11-year-old attorney correspondence, trying to absorb a version of my own history I'd had no idea existed until a few hours earlier. I remember calling in sick to work the next morning, something I almost never did, and spending most of the day simply sitting with the letters spread across my kitchen table, unable to focus on anything else. I thought about calling Derek at one point, my hand actually hovering over his contact in my phone before I set it back down. I wasn't ready yet to share this with anyone who might, even unintentionally, make me feel like I needed to manage their reaction to it on top of managing my own. I thought too about every family photo album I'd ever flipped through as a child, searching now in memory for some detail I might have overlooked, a resemblance that didn't quite match, a story about my birth that had always felt slightly vague compared to the specific, well-worn details my mother recited about Derek's arrival. I couldn't find anything concrete. If there had been clues, I'd been too young, or too trusting, or simply too unpracticed at questioning the family I'd been given to ever notice them. My mother's letter continued, several more paragraphs I'd been too overwhelmed to fully process the first time through. I know what you're probably feeling right now, and I know an apology from a letter written by someone who's already gone isn't going to be enough to undo 34 years of not knowing something this significant about yourself. I want to tell you one more thing before I close this out, something I should have found the courage to say to your face a long time ago in ordinary daylight, instead of only in a letter you'll read after I'm no longer here to answer your questions. I think somewhere in the back of my mind, for your entire childhood, I was afraid that loving you as fully and openly as I loved Derek would somehow reveal the secret. That if I let myself be too visibly devoted to you, someone would ask questions I wasn't prepared to answer, or worse, that I would slip and say something that gave it away. I told myself that was protective caution. I understand now that it was actually a kind of cowardice that cost you something you can never fully get back, a childhood where you knew, without doubt, that you were loved exactly as much as your brother. That is the thing I regret most in my entire life, Margot. Not the adoption itself, the years afterward when fear made me hold back a love I actually felt for you completely and let you grow up believing you'd somehow earned less of it. I sat with that paragraph for a long time. There was a strange, complicated relief in it, an explanation, finally, for something I'd spent 34 years quietly blaming myself for, some vague, unnamed deficiency I must have had that made me easier to love less. And there was also a fresh grief underneath the relief, sharp and specific, the realization that the distance I'd felt my entire childhood hadn't been imagined, hadn't been a misreading of ordinary parental unevenness. It had been real and deliberate, even if not maliciously so, and there was no version of the rest of my life where I got those particular years back. The letter closed with contact information for the Vermont law firm, along with a final line that I read probably a dozen times before I could make myself stop. Whatever you decide to do with this, whether you reach out to that family or choose to leave it alone entirely, please know that the choice is yours alone to make, and there is no version of it that would disappoint me, wherever I am by the time you're reading this. I only ask that you make the choice for yourself, Margot, and not out of any remaining obligation to protect the rest of us from a truth that was never yours to be protected from in the first place. I called the law firm the following morning, my hands shaking again as I dialed, and reached, after being transferred twice, an attorney named Sandra Whitcomb, who'd apparently inherited the file from a now retired colleague, but recognized the case immediately once I gave my name and birth date. Your sister, Mrs. Hargrove, passed away 4 years ago, Miss Callahan, but the trust she established remains active, and there's a personal letter she left specifically for you, to be delivered whenever contact was finally made. Would you like me to send it to you, or would you prefer to discuss the details of the trust first? I asked for the letter first. I think some part of me needed to hear from her in her own words before I let myself think about anything involving money at all. That's a wise instinct, she told me, and I could hear something genuine in her voice, not just professional courtesy. I only met Mrs. Hargrove a few times before she passed, but I can tell you she spent considerable time and resources over the years trying to locate you, long before it was easy to do that kind of search. She was not, from what I understood of her, a woman who gave up on things she'd decided mattered. I asked her, tentatively, what she could tell me about my biological mother, unable to wait the 2 days it would take for the letter to arrive by courier. I don't have many details myself, she admitted. Mrs. Hargrove was fairly private about the family history in our conversations. What I can tell you is there's also a biological father in the picture, still living, who I believe would very much welcome contact if you're ever interested in that. His information is included in the file Mrs. Hargrove left. I hung up the phone that afternoon with my hands still trembling, spending the following 2 days in a strange suspended state, unable to fully return to ordinary life, waiting for a letter from a grandmother I'd never known existed until a week earlier. The letter arrived by courier 2 days later, 4 pages in handwriting considerably more elegant than my mother's, from a woman named Eleanor Hargrove, who I'd never met and who had apparently spent the last 2 decades of her life searching for me anyway. My dear granddaughter, I have written some version of this letter probably a dozen times over the years, always uncertain whether it would ever actually find its way to you, and I find myself, even now, uncertain how to begin. So I will simply begin with the truth, since I understand, if you're reading this, that you've likely already learned enough of it to deserve the rest. Your mother, my daughter Josephine, was 20 years old when you were born, unmarried, and deeply in love with your biological father, a young man my late husband considered entirely unsuitable, not for any fault of his own character, but because of his family's more modest circumstances, a judgment I am deeply ashamed of to this day. My husband gave Josephine an ultimatum: give up the child quietly through a private arrangement he controlled every detail of, or be cut off entirely from the family, financially and otherwise, at 20 years old with no independent means of supporting a baby. Josephine fought him on this longer and harder than I think both of us expected, but in the end, alone, frightened, and without my full support, which I have never forgiven myself for withholding, she agreed to his terms. I want you to know that I did not agree with my husband's decision, though I lacked at the time the courage to oppose him as forcefully as I should have. That failure has haunted me for over 30 years, Margot, far more than almost anything else in my life. My husband passed away 19 years ago, and it was only after his death that I felt free enough to begin searching for you in earnest, without his disapproval hanging over every step. I hired private investigators. I petitioned courts for access to sealed records, most of which were denied. I spent over the years a considerable amount of both money and hope on a search that yielded almost nothing concrete for the first decade, until a private investigator finally located the adoption agency's dissolved records through a secondary source in 2015, which is how that first letter eventually made its way to your parents' address. I want you to understand that I never once stopped during those years, even during the long stretches when there was no meaningful progress to report to myself, let alone to anyone else. I stopped for a long moment, absorbing the shape of an entirely different story than the one I'd been quietly telling myself for 34 years. Not simply a young woman who didn't want me, but a young woman who'd fought for me and lost, and a family divided by that fight in ways that had apparently never fully healed. Josephine never recovered from what happened. She and your biological father, a man named Thomas Reyes, married 2 years later, once she was old enough to be independent of her father's control, and they searched for you together for years, through every legal channel available to them, most of which were deliberately closed off by the sealed nature of the arrangement my husband had orchestrated. Josephine passed away 9 years ago, Margot, a heart condition, sudden and unrelated to any of this, though I have always believed some of what happened to her heart in the years before that was not entirely physical. I am so sorry that you will never have the chance to meet her yourself. She thought about you every single day of her life. I know that with complete certainty because she told me so, more times than I could count. I had to set the letter down entirely at that point. I sat in my kitchen and cried in a way I hadn't since the day of my mother's funeral. Not for the mother I'd just buried this time, but for one I'd never known at all, a young woman named Josephine who'd apparently spent her whole short life quietly grieving a daughter she'd never stopped wanting. I sat with that grief for a long time before I could bring myself to keep reading, turning over the strange, disorienting math of it all, that I had, in some sense, 2 mothers now, one I'd just buried after 34 years of complicated, uneven love, and one I'd never met at all, who had apparently loved me completely and without complication for the brief span of years she'd known I existed, before losing me in a way that had shaped the rest of her too short life. I didn't know, sitting there, how to hold both of those truths at once. I still don't think I fully do, if I'm honest. Some griefs, I've come to understand, simply exist alongside each other rather than resolving into something tidier. The letter went on to explain the trust, established in my name at birth by Eleanor herself, funded initially with a modest sum and left to grow, largely untouched, for over 30 decades. The current balance, Sandra Whitcomb later confirmed when I was ready to discuss it, stood at just over $1.4 million. Eleanor's own estate, upon her death 4 years earlier, had also named me as a beneficiary, pending contact, an additional inheritance that, combined with the original trust, made the total considerably larger than I'd been prepared to process in a single sitting. I do not tell you any of this to make you feel obligated toward money you never asked for, Margot. I tell you because it was always, in every sense that matters, already yours, set aside for the day I hoped, against considerable odds, that we would finally find each other. I am gone now myself by the time you're reading this, but I hope you know that you were never once forgotten, not for a single day, by the family that lost you. We simply lost the ability to find our way back to you in time. I hope this, at least, finally gives you that. With all the love I was never given the chance to show you directly, your grandmother, Eleanor. I met with Sandra Whitcomb in person a week later, once I'd had time to absorb the letter and decide I was ready to understand the practical details of what Eleanor had left me. Her office was small and unpretentious, tucked into a converted Victorian house in a quiet part of town, and she walked me through the trust documents with the same warmth she'd shown on the phone, pausing frequently to ask whether I needed a break, whether the pace was too much all at once. "There's no obligation attached to any of this," she told me near the end of our meeting. Mrs. Hargrove was explicit about that in her instructions. "This isn't conditional on you maintaining a relationship with the remaining family or using the funds in any particular way. It was simply hers to give, and now it's yours to do with as you choose." I asked her before I left that day whether she'd known Josephine at all, whether there was anyone still living who might be able to tell me more about the mother I'd never had the chance to meet. That's when she mentioned Thomas Reyes for the first time and gave me his contact information, tucked into a folder along with copies of the trust documents I'd need to review with my own accountant in the weeks ahead. I spent the days after reading Eleanor's letter in a strange, suspended state, unable to fully return to the rhythms of ordinary life. I went back to work, technically, but I remember very little of that week with any clarity. I moved through client sessions on some kind of professional autopilot, while an entirely different, much larger conversation ran continuously underneath everything else I did. I found myself more than once staring at my own hands during a quiet moment, looking for trace of Josephine in them, some physical proof of a woman I'd never met, but who apparently shaped more of who I was than I'd ever had reason to suspect. I thought often during that stretch about the specific cruelty of timing, that Josephine had died 9 years before I ever learned any of this, meaning there had never been a version of events where the two of us could have met, could have had even one conversation, no matter what choice my adoptive parents had made about that letter 11 years earlier. Some part of that grief, I realized slowly, wasn't really about my parents' silence at all. It was simply the ordinary, unfixable grief of losing someone you never got the chance to know, compounded by the specific injustice of understanding that she'd spent her whole short life wanting exactly what I now wanted too, and neither of us had ever gotten it. I sat with both letters for nearly a week before I could make myself drive back to my father's house. I want to be honest about the state I was in during that week. It wasn't anger exactly, though there was some of that underneath everything else. It was closer to a kind of vertigo, the sensation of having the ground you've stood on your entire life quietly revealed as something other than solid. I went through my days on autopilot, present enough at work to function, but distracted in a way my colleagues noticed and gently asked about. Questions I deflected with vague references to grief, which wasn't exactly a lie, just an incomplete version of the truth. I called my father and asked him to meet me at the house, alone, on a Saturday afternoon. He seemed surprised by the formality of the request, but agreed without much resistance. and when I arrived, I found him in the kitchen, looking older and smaller than I remembered him looking even at the funeral just weeks earlier. I set both letters on the table between us, my mother's and Eleanor Hargrove's, and watched him go very still before he'd finished reading the first line. "You found it," he said quietly, not a question. "You knew. This whole time, you knew I was adopted, and you knew someone had been looking for me for years, and neither of you ever once considered telling me?" He didn't try to deny it, which, in its own strange way, was the first honest thing he'd offered me about any of this. "Your mother and I talked about it more times than you'd believe, especially after that letter came 11 years ago. We fought about it, actually, one of the worst fights of our marriage, if I'm honest. I wanted to tell you. I want you to know that much, at least. I lost that argument, and I've regretted it every year since, more than I think I ever let myself fully admit, even to myself." "Why did you lose it?" I asked. "What was her reasoning that you found convincing enough to go along with?" He was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee mug slowly between his hands, not drinking from it. Outside, I could hear a neighbor's lawnmower starting up, an oddly ordinary sound to accompany a conversation that felt like it was quietly rearranging the entire foundation of my life. "He was terrified," he finally said, "not of losing you to another family, exactly. I think she understood rationally that you were an adult, that a relationship with your biological family wouldn't have erased your relationship with us. I think she was terrified of what it would mean about the kind of mother she'd actually been. She always knew, I think, she knew from very early on that she loved Derek more easily than she loved you. She hated that about herself. I think some part of her was afraid that if you ever learned the full truth about the adoption and about how unevenly she'd loved you as a result of her own fear around it, you'd finally have a complete, undeniable reason to leave this family behind entirely. And I think, selfishly, she couldn't bear that possibility, even though keeping the secret probably guaranteed a version of exactly that outcome anyway, just slower and without you ever fully understanding why." I sat with that for a long moment, something in it landing with an uncomfortable, clarifying weight. So instead of risking me leaving with an explanation, I said, "She just let me spend 34 years believing I was simply less lovable than my brother, with no explanation at all." My father didn't defend that. He said, "I don't think either of us understood at the time how much worse that choice actually was. I think we told ourselves we were protecting the family. I understand now that we were mostly protecting ourselves." "What about you?" I asked. "What was your reasoning, separate from hers? You said you wanted to tell me. Why didn't you, once it became clear she wasn't going to?" He looked down at his hands for a long moment before answering. "Cowardice, mostly," he said. "I told myself it wasn't my secret alone to tell, that I owed her some loyalty as my wife, that the timing was never quite right. All of that was true, in a narrow sense. None of it was really the whole reason. The whole reason was that I was afraid of the same thing she was, just quieter about it. I was afraid that if you knew the full truth, you'd finally have enough reason to stop trying so hard to earn something from us that we should have simply given you freely all along, without you ever having to earn it at all." "Does Derek know?" I asked. "About any of this?" "No," my father said. "I don't think your mother ever intended for him to find out either, honestly. I think in her mind, the secret wasn't really about protecting the whole family. It was about protecting her own image of herself. Derek was just never a threat to that image the way this information about you was." I left my father's house that afternoon without fully resolving anything between us. Some things, I was beginning to understand, don't resolve cleanly in a single conversation, no matter how honest either party manages to be. But I drove home with something I hadn't had a week earlier. A full, undeniable explanation for a lifetime of feeling like I'd always come up short in a house that raised me as its own. Not an excuse for it, an explanation. I was beginning to understand that those were two very different things, and that only one of them actually mattered to my ability to finally move forward. I met my biological father, Thomas Reyes, 6 weeks later at a quiet restaurant roughly halfway between our two cities, a meeting Sandra Whitcomb helped arrange once I'd confirmed I was ready. I don't have the words, even now, to fully describe what it felt like to sit across from a stranger who shared my exact eye color, my exact laugh, apparently, according to him, down to the specific way I tilted my head when I was skeptical of something. Small, specific, undeniable pieces of myself I'd never once seen reflected back at me in the family that raised me. Thomas cried within the first 10 minutes of our conversation, openly, without any apparent embarrassment about it, and told me things about Josephine I don't think I'll ever stop being grateful to know. That she'd kept a small, worn photograph of the hospital bracelet from my birth in her wallet for the rest of her life. That she'd named a rescue dog Margaret years later, unable to fully explain to Thomas why the name felt important to her. That she'd talked about me in quiet, private moments right up until the year she died. She used to imagine what you might be doing on certain days, birthdays mostly. She'd get quiet around your birthday every year, and I learned after a while not to ask her about it directly, just to sit with her through it. I didn't fully understand what she was carrying until much later, honestly, once I understood more about what her father had done. He showed me photographs on his phone, dozens of them, Josephine at 22, at 30, at 38, the year before she died, a woman who looked in every single picture unmistakably like someone I might have grown into myself under different circumstances. I sat in that restaurant for nearly 3 hours, long after our food had gone cold, absorbing an entire life I'd never known existed, belonging to a woman who had, apparently, never once stopped belonging to me either, even from a distance she'd never chosen. We've stayed in touch since, tentatively at first, more consistently now. Thomas has a way of asking about my life that reminds me, more than I expected it to, of the way my adoptive father used to take me fishing, present, attentive, without any competing loyalty pulling his focus elsewhere. I don't know yet what to call the relationship we're slowly building. I've stopped needing to rush toward a label for it. I didn't pursue any legal action against my adoptive parents. There wasn't really a clear legal claim to pursue, and more than that, I found, once the initial vertigo of discovery settled, that punishment wasn't actually what I wanted. What I wanted, I came to understand slowly over the following months, was simply the truth finally being treated as mine to hold, instead of something managed and rationed out to protect everyone else's comfort at my expense. I used a portion of the inheritance to fund a scholarship in Josephine's name at the university she'd never gotten to finish herself, for young mothers navigating unplanned pregnancies who needed support to complete their education rather than being pressured into choices that weren't fully their own. I think, of everything I did with that money, it's the thing I'm proudest of, a small, ongoing correction to the specific unfairness that had shaped my entire existence before I was even born. The first scholarship recipient, a 19-year-old named Priya, who's raising her daughter while finishing a nursing degree, wrote me a letter last spring that I've kept in the same drawer as my mother's and Eleanor's. 3 generations of women's handwriting now, in some strange, unplanned way, all connected to the same quiet correction I never expected to be in a position to make. Priya wrote me that the scholarship meant more to her than the money itself, that knowing someone believed she deserved the chance to keep her daughter and still build a life worth having felt like being seen in a way she hadn't expected from a stranger. I think about that letter often. I think, in some way I can't fully articulate, it's the closest I've come to understanding what it must have felt like for Eleanor, all those years, refusing to let her me, even when every practical reason told her to. My relationship with my father, my adoptive father, Ray, though I've stopped needing to mentally qualify that word the way I did in the early months, has slowly, imperfectly, gotten more honest since that conversation at his kitchen table. He's asked, more than once, whether I could ever forgive him for going along with my mother's fear all those years. I've told him, each time, that I'm less interested in forgiveness as some clean, final transaction and more interested in whether he's willing to actually see me clearly now in whatever time we have left, instead of managing me the way he and my mother once did. He's tried. It isn't perfect, but it's honest, finally, and I've learned that honest is worth considerably more than easy. He came with me, actually, on my second visit to meet Thomas, which surprised me more than almost anything else that happened during those first difficult months. The two of them sat across from each other for nearly an hour, two men who'd both, in their own different ways, lost years with me, one through a decision that was never his to make, the other through a silence he allowed to continue long after he'd realized it was wrong. I watched them find an uneasy, careful kind of respect for each other at the end of that lunch, neither man quite an enemy to the other, both of them simply two people who loved the same daughter imperfectly, in circumstances neither of them had fully chosen. I used to think there wasn't room for both of them, my father told me afterwards, in the car, staring straight ahead rather than at me. I think that's part of why I went along with my mother's fear more than I should have. I understand now that isn't how it actually works. There was always room. I just didn't trust that there was. Derek doesn't know the full story yet. I've told him I was adopted. That much felt necessary, and he took it with more grace than I expected, though I could tell it settled something else in his own understanding of our family, too. He called me twice in the weeks after I told him, asking careful, halting questions, clearly trying to figure out how to hold this new information about his own family without quite knowing where to put it.
"Does this change anything?" he asked me during one of those calls. And I understood, from the tone of his voice, that he wasn't really asking about logistics. He was asking whether it changed us, whether I was still, in whatever way mattered most, his sister. "No," I told him, and I meant it, even through everything else I was still working through. "It doesn't change that. It changes some other things, but not that." I haven't yet told him the rest, about the trust, about the specific unevenness in how we were each loved, about the letter our mother left explaining why. Part of that is protectiveness, I'll admit. Derek has always had a more fragile relationship with our mother's memory than I expected, given how much more easily she'd loved him, and I'm not entirely sure what it would do to him to learn that even the love he'd always taken for granted had been, in its own way, entangled with our mother's fear and guilt about me. Part of it is simply that I don't yet know if it's mine to share. Some truths, I have come to understand, are mine to hold privately if I choose, and I no longer feel obligated to manage anyone else's comfort by deciding for them what they need to know. I still keep my mother's letter, the original one, in a drawer in my own bedroom now, not framed, not displayed, just close enough to reach when I need to. I read it sometimes, on the harder days, not for the explanation anymore, I've absorbed that fully by now, but for the specific line near the end, the one about wishing she'd loved me as visibly as she loved Derek, the one that finally told me, in her own words, after 34 years of silence, that the love had actually been there all along, just buried under a fear she never found the courage to overcome while she still had time. If you've ever spent your life wondering why you always seem to come up short in your own family, why the love directed your way always felt somehow smaller, more conditional, harder won than what everyone else seemed to receive without trying, I hope you eventually find your own version of the truth, whatever shape it takes. Sometimes it isn't clean or comfortable when it finally arrives. Sometimes it comes wrapped in grief for what you can never get back, alongside relief for finally understanding you were never actually the problem to begin with. Both of those things, I've learned, can be true at exactly the same time. There's a small framed photograph on my mantel now, one Thomas gave me during our second meeting, Josephine at maybe 19, a year before I was born, laughing at something outside the frame, entirely unaware of everything that was coming. I think about her at that age sometimes, before any of it, before the family pressure and the private arrangement and the decades of quiet grief that followed.
I wonder if she'd recognize the life I've built since finding out the truth. I think somehow she would be glad of it, not the specific shape of the loss that made it necessary, but the fact that I finally stopped believing I'd earned less love than I actually deserved. I visit Eleanor's grave sometimes, a few hours' drive from my house, though I never got the chance to meet her while she was alive. I bring flowers, and I sit for a while, and I tell her, out loud, about the scholarship, about Priya, about the slow, imperfect repair happening with my father. I don't know if any of it reaches her wherever she is. I find, standing there anyway, that it reaches something in me, some part of myself I'd spent 34 years not fully trusting was worth the effort of tending. I think, sometimes, about the moment my mother reached for my hand during one of her lucid stretches near the end, holding on a beat longer than the moment required, and I understand now, in a way I couldn't have at the time, that some part of her must have been trying, in whatever limited way her fear allowed, to say everything the letter would eventually say more fully once she was gone. I choose to believe that. I choose to believe that the love was real, even if it took her entire life, and mine, and a hidden compartment in a jewelry box to finally find its way to me in full. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to know which part stayed with you the longest, and if you haven't yet, consider joining our little community here at Silent Victory Stories. We tell these stories because so many of you have lived versions of them yourselves, and there's something quietly powerful about knowing you were never actually alone in it, even during the years it felt that way.